Welcome to the world of Delicious in Dungeon, a manga and anime series that has taken the concept of Dungeons and Dragons to a whole new level. Today we're going to explore how the creator Ryoko Kui drew influences from Dungeons and Dragons to craft this vibrant, living dungeon ecosystem. I also want to discuss how the series helped me, as a dungeon master, rethink dungeon creation and dungeon ecology. For those unfamiliar, Delicious in Dungeon is a story about a group of adventurers who venture into a dangerous dungeon to rescue a fallen comrade. However, they lack any food and resources to actually sustain their journey, so they decide to cook and eat monsters that they encounter. This is just the beginning of what makes this series so fascinating, so let's get started with a quick summary. The story follows Laos, an adventurer, along with his companions Marcel, a skilled mage, Chilchuck, a halfling, and Senshi, a dwarf warrior and expert chef. The table is set for a typical D&D adventure. They delve into the depths of a sprawling dungeon, encounter various monsters, and use them as ingredients for their meals. The series blends humor, adventure, and culinary creativity, and it also offers a fresh take on the dungeon crawling genre. Ryoko Kui's influence from Dungeons and Dragons are evident throughout Delicious in Dungeon. From the variety of monsters to the intricate dungeon designs, fans of D&D will recognize these elements. There's also the aspect of the cozy viewing experience that you have while enjoying this show, as it's often a kind of culinary cooking experience that has a cozy vibe to it. In traditional Dungeons and Dragons, dungeons are often seen as static places just filled with random monsters. Whatever you want, it's there. However, Delicious in Dungeon portrays them as a dynamic, living environment where creatures interact and rely on each other, much like a real ecosystem. Approaching dungeon creation this way brings a whole new level of depth and immersion to the story. One of the most fascinating characters in the series, Senshi, is a culinary expert, and he has extensive knowledge of the dungeon and its inhabitants that add a unique layer to the narrative. His understanding of the ecosystem is unparalleled and allows the party not only to survive but thrive within the dungeon. One of the best examples of this is in the water level of the dungeon.
Check it out. The fish are eating the kraken.
Now the population of mid-sized monsters should gradually recover.
Oh, my stomach's feeling.
Here we see various sea creatures, each playing a role in the food chain. And Senshi explains how these creatures interact to form this kind of hierarchy and to form this ecology. This meticulous attention to detail makes the dungeon feel alive and believable, and it is an attribute that should be taken and applied to the dungeons that you are planning in your own games. By understanding the natural behaviors and the relationships between these creatures, you can create a dungeon that feels like it is alive, that appeals to the common sense and logic of the players who are exploring, and continue to carry that sense of verisimilitude, like if this place is real and exists. This practical use of dungeon ecology is something that can greatly enhance any D&D campaign. By understanding the natural behaviors and relationships of these creatures, Senshi is able to create meals that not only sustain the party, but also keeps them energized and rested. This practical use of dungeon ecology is something that can greatly enhance any D&D experience. By understanding the natural behaviors and relationships of these creatures, it helps to further instill in the players that this is a real place and can also be used to help integrate plot points and history from the dungeon. Before watching Delicious in Dungeon, my approach to dungeon creation was quite simplistic. Monsters were there for the players to fight, traps were obstacles to overcome, and treasure was the reward. But I had never thought about the possibilities of making the dungeon more immersive and realistic. Who planted these traps? How do they keep them well maintained? Who placed these monsters in here? And how do they eat? Where do they sleep? Incorporating a living ecosystem into my dungeons has transformed the way my players interact with the world. Instead of seeing monsters as mere challenges, they now consider how these monsters live, what they eat, and how they affect their environment. This has added a new layer of strategy and engagement to our sessions. Now you may be asking yourself, who cares? I just want my players to run into a dungeon, kill some bad guys, get some loot, and get out of it. But by paying this special attention to your world, you also give your players permission to think deeper about their own characters. For example, In Delicious in Dungeon, we mainly learn a lot about the elves, not by meeting a ton of them or reading about their history, but by seeing how people react to Marsil, one of the main elves that we see in this story. And by paying attention to these interactions, to the ways that these people are interconnected, our players have permission to make these same connections with their own characters. By building a world with a persistent logic, our players are able to make logical leaps and jumps that would help inform them about their characters' choices and about the world that the characters have lived in. Because of this, your stories will be richer, your engagements will have more depth, and your world will start to feel like not only has it been built together by your collaborative play, but like it's taken on a life of its own. Ryoko Kui's Delicious in Dungeon is a masterclass in world building and storytelling. By drawing from Dungeons and Dragons and paying close attention to details, the series creates a dungeon that feels alive and captivating. Constantly you're asking, where does this end? Constantly peeling back the layers of the onion to reveal its center. As a dungeon master, it has inspired me to think beyond the traditional tropes and to create environments that are dynamic, believable, and engaging. If you haven't yet, I highly recommend diving into Delicious in Dungeon. Whether you're a fan of fantasy, a culinary enthusiast, or a dungeon master looking for inspiration, this series has something for everyone. Thank you for watching, and happy adventuring.